The American Marine, crouching in the shell crater on the beach at Saipan on the morning of June 15, 1944, could hear Japanese machine gun fire raking the beach from positions in the hills overlooking the landing zones, approximately 300 yards inland, with the bullets striking sand and water around him, creating small geysers, where rounds impacted and occasionally hitting Marines who were attempting to advance inland from the beach, where landing craft continued depositing troops and equipment, despite heavy fire that was destroying amphibious tractors and killing men before they could even exit the vehicles that were supposed to carry them across the beach and inland to positions where they could organize for the advance into Saipan's interior. Private First Class Robert Chen of Company E, 2nd Battalion, 6th Marine Regiment, 2nd Marine Division, had been in the first wave that hit the beach at 1840 hours after a 2-hour run from the transport ships that had been anchored approximately 12 miles offshore beyond range of Japanese coastal artillery, jumping from his landing craft into chest-deep water approximately 50 yards from shore and wading through surf while being shot at by Japanese forces who had remained hidden during the preliminary bombardment and who had allowed the landing craft to approach close to shore before opening fire with machine guns, mortars, and artillery that had been pre-registered on the beaches to achieve maximum effect against Marines who were most vulnerable while in the water, and while climbing onto the beach where they had no cover except for whatever terrain features existed or whatever they could create by digging into sand. The Battle of Saipan, beginning on June 15, 1944, when 2 Marine divisions supported by massive naval gunfire and carrier airstrikes launched amphibious assault against the island that had been Japanese territory since World War I, when Japan had occupied German colonial possessions in the Pacific, and extending until July 9, 1944, when organized Japanese resistance ended after 25 days of brutal fighting that saw American forces advance across an island measuring only 12 miles long by 5 miles wide, while facing Japanese defenders who fought from elaborate cave and bunker systems, who launched counterattacks including the war's largest Banzai charge, and who ultimately suffered casualties exceeding 95% of the garrison, including thousands who committed suicide rather than surrendering, represented one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War, and the battle that brought American forces to within bombing range of Japanese home islands for the first time, making Saipan's capture strategically critical for the eventual defeat of Japan through strategic bombing, and making the battle's outcome inevitable once American forces established a secure beachhead, despite Japanese determination to defend every foot of the island, and despite Japanese willingness to accept casualties that American commanders considered insane, but the Japanese military culture considered honorable and necessary. Saipan, volcanic island in the Mariana Islands chain, located approximately 1,500 miles south of Tokyo and approximately 3,700 miles west of Pearl Harbor, held strategic importance vastly exceeding what its small size of approximately 70 square miles might suggest to observers unfamiliar with Pacific War geography and strategy. The island served as administrative center for Japan's Central Pacific territories, as headquarters for Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor and who now commanded Japanese naval forces in the Marianas, as base for Japanese aircraft that could intercept American bombers attempting to reach targets in the Western Pacific, as site of 2 operational airfields and a 3rd under construction that Japanase forces used to support operations throughout the region, and most critically as the objective that American planners had identified as necessary first step toward establishing bases for B-29 Super Fortress bombers that would begin sustained strategic bombing campaign against Japanese home islands once airfields on Saipan could be constructed or expanded to accommodate the massive four-engine bombers whose range of approximately 3,000 miles would allow them to reach Tokyo from Saipan with adequate bomb loads. The island's geography combined volcanic mountains rising dramatically from the sea to elevations exceeding 1,500 feet at Mount Tepochau that dominated the island's center and provided observation over the entire island and over surrounding waters, with coastal plains on the western side where beaches of coral sand provided the only suitable landing sites for amphibious operations, with the interior being covered with dense tropical vegetation, including areas of jungle where visibility was measured in yards and where movement off trails was extremely difficult, and with the volcanic rock that formed much of the island being riddled with natural caves the Japanese engineers had expanded and connected to create defensive systems that were virtually impregnable to anything except direct assault by infantry, supported by tanks, flamethrowers, and demolitions. The civilian population of approximately 30,000, including approximately 25,000 Japanese civilians who had emigrated to Saipan during the decades of Japanese administration, and approximately 5,000 indigenous Chamorro and Carolinian people who had lived on the island before Japanese occupation, would become tragic victims of the battle, with thousands being killed during the American bombardment and ground fighting, and with thousands more committing suicide during the battle's final days when Japanese propaganda and pressure from Japanese military authorities convinced them that Americans would commit atrocities against prisoners and that death was preferable to capture. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the Joint Expeditionary Force for Operation Forager, the code name for the invasion of the Marianas, including Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, and Lieutenant General Holland Smith, commanding the Amphibious Corps that would conduct ground operations, understood from intelligence reports and from previous experience in Pacific Island campaigns that Saipan would represent the most difficult amphibious operation attempted to that point in the war, exceeding the challenges of Tarawa in November 1943, where heavy casualties, including approximately 1,000 Marines killed in 76 hours of fighting, had shocked American public and had led to improvements in amphibious tactics and in preliminary bombardment procedures that planners hoped would reduce casualties at Saipan. The Japanese garrison on Saipan numbered approximately 31,629 troops, based on American intelligence estimates that would prove accurate, including approximately 25,000 soldiers from the 43rd Division under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, approximately 6,000 naval infantry and base personnel under Admiral Nagumo, and smaller numbers of support troops, significantly outnumbering the approximately 4,800 Japanese defenders at Tarawa, and being better equipped with more artillery, more prepared with months rather than weeks to construct defenses, and being positioned on island whose size of 70 square miles provided depth for defense in depth rather than Tarawa's 291 acres, where defenders had been concentrated in small area that American firepower could devastate. The American forces committed to Saipan assault represented the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific to that date, with the 2nd Marine Division under Major General Thomas Watson and the 4th Marine Division under Major General Harry Schmidt assigned to conduct the initial assault landings on western beaches designated as beaches red, green, blue, and yellow, covering approximately 8,000 yards of coastline, plus the 27th Infantry Division under Major General Ralph Smith, held in floating reserve and prepared to land once beachhead was secured and to participate in subsequent operations advancing across the island. The total American ground forces committed to Saipan eventually exceeded 71,000 troops, including the 3 assault divisions, plus corps troops, artillery, engineers, and extensive service and support units required to sustain operations on island that lacked port facilities and where all supplies would have to be brought across beaches, giving Americans numerical advantage exceeding 2-1 over Japanese defenders, but with that advantage being partially offset by defender advantages of prepared positions, interior lines allowing rapid movement of reserves, and willingness to accept casualties that American forces would consider suicidal. The preliminary operations beginning on June 11th, 4 days before the scheduled landing, included the most intensive pre-invasion bombardment yet conducted in the Pacific War with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. From Task Force 52 and Task Force 53, closing to ranges as short as 3,000 yards from shore to fire thousands of shells at targets that had been identified through aerial reconnaissance conducted during preceding weeks, and through intelligence reports from submarine periscope observations and from radio intercepts that had provided information about Japanese defensive positions and about locations of command posts, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. The battleships, including 7 old battleships from the attack on Pearl Harbor that had been repaired and modernized, plus 2 modern fast battleships, provided the heavy bombardment with 14-inch and 16-inch guns, firing shells weighing up to 2,700 pounds that could penetrate concrete and could destroy all but the most heavily protected bunkers with direct hits, while cruisers with 8-inch and 6-inch guns and destroyers with 5-inch guns engaged targets that required less destructive power or that required more rapid fire than battleship guns could provide. The naval gunfire during the 4 days of preliminary bombardment expended approximately 165,000 shells, totaling approximately 7,500 tons of explosives, creating visible devastation along the coastline and in areas where Japanese positions had been identified, but achieving less destruction of Japanese defenses than American planners hoped because many Japanese positions were deeply buried or were in caves where only direct hits could destroy them, and because Japanese defenders remained hidden during bombardment, rather than revealing positions by attempting to return fire. Carrier aircraft from Task Force 58 supplemented naval gunfire with approximately 2,400 sorties dropping bombs and firing rockets at targets throughout the island, achieving destruction of most Japanese aircraft that had been based on Saipan's airfields, and achieving damage to many buildings and installations, but again achieving limited effect against prepared defensive positions that were designed to survive aerial attack. The debate between Marine commanders who wanted extended bombardment and Navy commanders who argued that 4 days was adequate created tensions that reflected different service perspectives, with Marines arguing from experience that Japanese defenses were extremely difficult to destroy from sea or air, and that longer bombardment would save Marine lives during the assault, while Navy argued that extended bombardment would sacrifice surprise and would consume ammunition that might be needed during the battle, and that 4 days represented maximum bombardment time that operational schedule would allow. The compromise of 4 days would prove inadequate, with Japanese defenses surviving largely intact, and with Marine casualties during the landing being heavy, despite the intensive bombardment that had preceded it. Private Chen had been aboard the transport ship USS Middleton for 3 days before the landing, spending the time checking equipment, attending briefings that described Japanese defenses and that outlined assault plan, writing letters home to his family in San Francisco that he might not survive to mail but that he wanted written in case he was killed, and attempting to sleep despite the anxiety that affected everyone aboard ship who knew that amphibious assault was among the most dangerous military operations, and that casualties were inevitable. Chen's combat experience included previous action at Tarawa, where he had been wounded by shrapnel but had returned to duty, giving him knowledge of what to expect during an amphibious assault and creating anxiety based on that knowledge rather than the anxiety of ignorance that affected Marines who were landing in combat for the first time. The loading into landing craft began at 600 hours on June 15th, with Marines climbing down cargo nets from transport ships into LCVPs, landing craft vehicle personnel, that bobbed in swells alongside the ships, requiring timing to step from net into craft without being crushed between craft and ship's hull or falling into water between them. The landing craft circled in designated assembly areas while forming into waves that would hit beach in coordinated sequence, with first wave consisting of amphibious tractors, LVTs, that could cross reefs and beach obstacles and that would carry assault troops directly inland rather than stopping at water's edge as conventional landing craft did. The run to the beach took approximately 2 hours, with landing craft maintaining formation, while naval gunfire continued pounding Japanese positions, and while aircraft made final strikes attempting to suppress defensive fires immediately before landing craft reached shore. The visibility of the island grew as landing craft approached, with mountains becoming distinct features, and with smoke from fires started by bombardment being visible, rising from multiple locations, with Chen and other Marines in his landing craft being able to see explosions from naval shells hitting shore and being able to see aircraft pulling up after bombing runs. The tension increased as distance to shore decreased, with Marines checking weapons and equipment for the final time, with officers and NCOs providing last-minute reminders about assault objectives and tactics, and with men dealing with fear in various ways, including prayer, jokes that weren't particularly funny but that provided release, silence while contemplating what was about to occur, or conversation about anything except the landing to distract from thinking about it. The Japanese defensive fire began when landing craft reached points approximately 500 yards from shore, earlier than Chen expected based on Tarawa, where Japanese had held fire until craft were much closer, with artillery shells beginning to fall among the landing craft, creating waterspouts where shells hit water and creating explosions and shrapnel where shells hit craft directly. Chen's landing craft was not hit during the approach, though craft to his left took direct hit that killed or wounded everyone aboard, with craft sinking rapidly and with survivors struggling in water while attempting to reach shore or attempting to be rescued by other craft that were continuing toward beach and could not stop to pick up survivors. The order to disembark came when craft grounded on reef approximately 50 yards from visible beach, with ramp dropping and with Marines pouring out into water that was deeper than briefings had suggested it would be, with Chen going under briefly when he stepped off ramp into water that was over his head, before surfacing and beginning to wade toward shore while holding rifle above water to keep it functional. The Japanese machine gun fire was continuous and heavy, creating splashes all around wading Marines and hitting many who fell into water and either drowned if wounds prevented them from keeping heads above water, or if equipment weight pulled them under, or who were helped by comrades who attempted to support wounded and to keep them moving toward shore where they might find cover. The distance from reef to beach was approximately 50 yards that took perhaps 3 minutes to wade, 3 minutes during which Chen expected to be shot at any moment and during which he saw Marines around him being hit and falling. 3 minutes that felt far longer than any 3 minutes he had experienced, and that would remain among his most vivid memories of the war. The arrival at the beach provided no sense of safety, because beach was being swept by fire from multiple directions, and because there was no cover except slight depression in sand or occasional debris from damaged landing craft. But being on solid ground rather than in water provided psychological relief, even though objective danger remained extreme. The seawall that Chen had been briefed about as providing covered route inland was approximately 30 yards across open beach from where he left the water, requiring sprint across sand while being shot at from Japanese positions that had perfect observation of the beach and perfect fields of fire that covered every inch of the beach and the approaches to it. Chen made the sprint with other Marines from his boat team, running in crouch while attempting to present smallest possible target and while being driven by adrenaline that made the exhaustion from waiting and from carrying equipment temporarily irrelevant, reaching the seawall and diving behind it to join perhaps 25 Marines from various units who had reached this position and who were attempting to organize for advance inland. The chaos on the beach during the first hour exceeded what even veterans like Chen had experienced at Tarawa, with units becoming intermixed as landing craft landed at wrong positions due to current and due to coxswains attempting to avoid obstacles or damaged craft, with communications being nearly impossible as radios were damaged by water and salt spray, or were simply overwhelmed by number of stations attempting to transmit simultaneously, with officers and NCOs becoming casualties, creating leadership vacuum, until someone took charge regardless of rank, with wounded being scattered across beach requiring medical attention, but with corpsmen being overwhelmed by numbers and being unable to reach all who needed treatment, and with supplies including ammunition, water, and medical supplies being landed but being scattered across beach rather than being organized at designated supply points as plans had called for. The advance inland from the seawall began when sufficient Marines had assembled, and when someone, Chen never knew exactly who because units were so mixed, organized assault on Japanese positions approximately 100 yards inland that were firing on beach and preventing further advance. The assault involved approximately 40 Marines advancing in short rushes while some provided covering fire, moving from whatever cover was available to next cover while being fired at continuously from Japanese positions that were difficult to identify because they were camouflaged and because muzzle flashes were difficult to see in bright sunlight. The advance covered perhaps 100 yards in approximately 30 minutes of intense fighting that cost perhaps 10 Marines killed or wounded before the Japanese position was overrun and its defenders were killed in close combat. The Japanese defensive positions encountered during first day's fighting demonstrated the effectiveness of months of preparation and the skill of Japanese engineers in utilizing terrain and in constructing positions that provided maximum protection while allowing defenders to deliver fire on attacking forces. The typical Japanese defensive position consisted of bunker constructed of coconut logs or of reinforced concrete depending on location and importance, with walls being thick enough to withstand anything except direct hits from large caliber naval shells or from bombs, with firing ports being small and being designed to provide limited field of fire that prevented attackers from firing into ports while allowing defenders to fire out, with positions being mutually supporting, meaning that any position being attacked from front would be covered by fire from adjacent positions, preventing attackers from approaching without being exposed to fire from multiple directions, and with positions having multiple exits, allowing defenders to withdraw if position became untenable or allowing reinforcements to enter without being exposed to fire. The tactics for reducing Japanese positions required combined arms approach using infantry, armor, engineers, and supporting fires in coordinated manner that isolated position and then destroyed it through direct assault. The typical sequence involved infantry locating position and fixing defenders with rifle and machine gun fire while radioing for tank support, tank approaching position while infantry provided suppressive fire, preventing Japanese defenders from engaging tank with anti-tank weapons, tank firing main gun into firing ports or against walls attempting to create breach, engineers approaching with demolitions or with flamethrowers while covered by tank and by infantry, demolitions being placed at entrances or against walls or flamethrower fuel being directed into firing ports or entrances, charges being detonated or flamethrower being fired, creating explosion or fire that killed defenders, and infantry clearing position to ensure all defenders were dead and to prevent position being reoccupied. The M4 Sherman medium tanks that landed during afternoon of June 15th after beaches were secured sufficiently to allow armored vehicles to come ashore, provided crucial support for infantry attacking Japanese positions, with the tank's 75mm guns being able to engage bunkers at ranges where infantry weapons were ineffective, and with tanks' armor providing protection from Japanese fire, allowing tanks to approach positions that infantry could not reach without taking heavy casualties. But tanks operating without infantry support were vulnerable to Japanese anti-tank tactics, including suicide attacks, where individual Japanese soldiers would attempt to place explosives on tanks or would attempt to climb onto tanks and to attack crew through hatches, requiring tank infantry cooperation, where infantry protected tanks from close assault while tanks provided fire support for infantry. Sergeant David Martinez, commanding tank from Company C, 2nd Tank Battalion, supporting 2nd Marine Division's assault-learned tank infantry cooperation through trial and error, during June 15th when his tank advanced ahead of supporting infantry and was attacked by Japanese soldier who climbed onto tank and attempted to place explosive charge on engine deck, before being shot by infantry who caught up to tank. The incident impressed on Martinez the necessity of maintaining contact with infantry and of never operating more than perhaps 50 yards ahead of infantry, who could protect tank from close assault, lesson that would be applied throughout remainder of campaign, and that would become standard tank infantry doctrine in Pacific Island fighting. The flamethrowers that engineers used against Japanese bunkers and cave positions represented one of most effective weapons for attacking fortifications where defenders could not be reached by small arms or artillery fire, with flamethrowers projecting stream of burning fuel up to approximately 40 yards that would enter bunkers through firing ports or entrances, and that would consume oxygen and kill defenders through asphyxiation, even if flames did not burn them directly. And that would terrify defenders, creating psychological effects exceeding physical effects, though physical effects were horrific enough with defenders being burned alive or suffocating from smoke inhalation. The flamethrower operators required exceptional courage, because carrying highly visible flamethrower tanks and approaching Japanese positions within flamethrower range of 30-40 yards made them priority targets for Japanese defenders who understood that destroying flamethrower before it could be employed would eliminate primary threat to their positions. Private First Class William Thompson from 2nd Marines' Engineer Company operated flamethrower during assault on Japanese cave position on June 17th, approaching within 30 yards while being covered by rifle squad that suppressed Japanese fire from cave entrance, directing stream of burning fuel into cave entrance for approximately 10 seconds until fuel tank was exhausted, and watching as flames flashed out of cave entrances and smoke poured out, suggesting that defenders inside had been killed. The post-action inspection of cave after it was secured found approximately 30 Japanese dead, inside from combination of burns and from suffocation, confirming flamethrowers' effectiveness, but also revealing horror of the weapon that killed through methods that seemed particularly cruel even in context of war where killing was necessary and expected. The capture of Aslido airfield, located on Saipan's southern end, represented first major objective achieved during battle, with the airfield being assigned to 27th Infantry Division that landed on June 16-17 after Marines had secured sufficient beachhead to allow Army Division to come ashore. The advance toward Aslido required fighting through Japanese defensive positions similar to those Marines encountered on other parts of island, with Army troops employing tactics similar to Marine tactics, because island terrain and Japanese defensive methods did not vary significantly across different sectors. The capture of Aslido on June 18 after 2 days of fighting provided American forces with airfield that could be used for emergency landings by damaged aircraft and eventually for basing fighter aircraft that would provide close air support, though the airfield required extensive repair before it could be fully operational, because Japanese had cratered runways and destroyed facilities, and because American bombardment had caused additional damage. The advance northward from southern Saipan toward island's interior during late June saw American forces attacking across terrain that became increasingly difficult as mountains replaced coastal plains and as Japanese defenders established defensive lines across island, utilizing terrain that favored defense and that made American advances costly. The 3 American divisions advanced abreast with 4th Marine Division on right along eastern coast, 27th Infantry Division in center, and 2nd Marine Division on left along western coast, creating battle line approximately 5 miles wide, advancing northward against Japanese resistance that varied from light rearguard actions to intense defensive stands where Japanese fought until being killed or until being forced to withdraw by being outflanked. Mount Tapachau, rising to 1,054 feet in island center, provided Japanese forces with observation over entire American advance, and with defensive positions where natural caves and rocky terrain allowed construction of positions that were nearly impregnable to direct assault, requiring extensive use of supporting fires, and requiring multiple assaults before positions could be secured. The fighting for Mount Tapachau during June 25-27 saw 2nd Marine Division and 27th Infantry Division both attacking positions on mountain slopes, with Marines attacking from west and Army attacking from south, with Japanese defending from prepared positions that had interlocking fields of fire and that could be supported by artillery positioned elsewhere on island. Private Chen participated in attack on Mount Tapachau's western slopes on June 26, climbing through rough terrain while carrying combat load that seemed to grow heavier with each step, being shot at from positions that were difficult to identify because muzzle flashes were obscured by terrain and by vegetation, and experiencing heat and exhaustion that caused several Marines in his platoon to collapse from heat stroke requiring evacuation, even though battalion could not afford to lose combat effectives to non-combat casualties. The advance gained approximately 300 yards during 6 hours of fighting on June 26, with gains being measured in yards per hour rather than miles per day, and with casualties, including Corporal Harrison, Chen's squad leader who had survived Tarawa and who had led squad with skill and courage, being killed by Japanese sniper fire while exposing himself to direct assault on Japanese machine gun position that was pinning down his squad. The death of Harrison affected Chen deeply, despite having experienced numerous casualties during previous fighting, with Harrison having been mentor who had taught Chen how to survive in combat and who had demonstrated leadership that inspired confidence even in most difficult situations. The reality of combat was that leaders who demonstrated courage and who exposed themselves to danger to lead effectively were more likely to be casualties than troops who stayed in covered positions, creating situation where units lost their best leaders and where survivors had to step up to fill leadership roles for which they might not feel prepared, but which had to be filled if unit was to function effectively. The Japanese counterattack during night of June 26-27 represented largest offensive action undertaken by Japanese forces during battle, with approximately 3,000 to 3,500 Japanese troops from various units being assembled for attack against American lines near center of American position, where 27th Infantry Division held positions between two Marine divisions. The attack was planned and commanded by Lieutenant General Saito, who understood that organized defense was failing and who calculated that counterattack might disrupt American operations sufficiently to allow Japanese forces to regroup, or at minimum would inflict casualties on Americans, and would demonstrate Japanese determination to continue fighting regardless of tactical situation. The attack began approximately 500 hours on June 27th, with Japanese troops advancing in waves against American positions that were held primarily by two battalions from 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Division, with Japanese soldiers shouting and with officers leading attacks with samurai swords drawn. The initial Japanese assault achieved surprise because American forces did not expect counterattack of this scale, and because darkness prevented effective observation of Japanese approach until they were very close to American positions, with some Japanese forces penetrating American lines before being engaged. The fighting was at close quarters, with some positions being overrun before defenders could organize effective response, with Japanese attackers using momentum and numbers to overwhelm positions through sheer weight of assault. The American response to counterattack involved commitment of reserves, including tank companies that moved forward in darkness to engage Japanese forces that had penetrated American lines, artillery fires from multiple battalions creating defensive fires in front of American positions and on Japanese assembly areas where additional troops were waiting to exploit any breakthrough, and reorganization of defensive lines where penetrations had occurred to contain Japanese advances and to prevent expansion of breaches. The fighting continued through early morning hours, with intensity gradually decreasing as Japanese forces suffered casualties that reduced their combat power, and as American defensive fires took effect, destroying Japanese formations before they could reach American positions, or destroying them after they had penetrated before they could exploit their gains. The casualties from counterattack exceeded 2,500 Japanese killed during attack or during subsequent mopping up operations that destroyed isolated Japanese groups that had penetrated American lines but had become surrounded, while American casualties totaled approximately 406 killed and approximately 512 wounded. The casualty ratio heavily favoring Americans demonstrated that while Japanese forces could launch attacks with fanatical determination and could achieve initial tactical success through surprise and through willingness to accept casualties, such attacks could not succeed against prepared defenses supported by artillery and armor, and could not change strategic situation where American numerical and material superiority made eventual American victory inevitable, regardless of tactical setbacks. The collapse of organized Japanese defense following failure of June 27th counterattack led Japanese commanders, including General Saito and Admiral Nagumo, to recognize that further organized resistance was impossible and that only option remaining was to conduct final suicide attack that would inflict maximum casualties on American forces before Japanese defenders were killed. The preparations for final Banzai charge included issuing orders to all Japanese units to assemble for attack, destroying equipment and documents that could not be carried, issuing final rations and ammunition to troops who would participate in attack, and preparing propaganda messages to civilian population urging them to commit suicide rather than surrendering to Americans who would supposedly torture and kill prisoners. The final Banzai charge during early morning hours of July 7th involved approximately 3,000 to 4,000 Japanese soldiers plus several hundred civilians who had been armed with spears, clubs, or improvised weapons, assembling in areas near village of Makunsha on Saipan's northern end, where American lines were held primarily by units from 27th Infantry Division. The attack was planned to begin before dawn, when darkness would provide some concealment during approach and when surprise might be achieved before American defenders were fully alert, with Japanese forces being organized in rough waves that would attack successively, maintaining pressure on American positions and preventing defenders from recovering between assaults. The Banzai charge began approximately 04:45 hours on July 7th, with first wave of several hundred Japanese soldiers emerging from assembly areas approximately 500 yards from American positions and charging across open ground while shouting Banzai and firing rifles or carrying swords and bayonets. The American positions that bore brunt of initial assault were held by 1st and 2nd Battalions, 105th Infantry Regiment, whose troops had been exhausted by weeks of continuous combat and who were not at full strength due to casualties, creating a situation where Japanese numerical advantage at point of attack was significant, despite American overall numerical superiority across entire island. The initial Japanese assault overwhelmed several American positions through sheer momentum and through numbers of attackers that simply could not be stopped by defensive fires before they reached American lines, with Japanese forces penetrating approximately 1,500 yards into American rear areas before being stopped by hastily organized defensive positions and by commitment of reserves including service troops, artillerymen fighting as infantry, and anyone who could hold rifle being pressed into defensive line to contain penetration. The fighting during Banzai charge was savage and primal, with some American positions fighting hand-to-hand against Japanese attackers who had penetrated trenches, with other positions maintaining integrity through disciplined fire that created zones of death that Japanese had to cross to reach positions, and with artillery firing at minimum ranges, creating defensive fires directly in front of American positions where Japanese were massing for assaults. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, commanding 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry Regiment, was killed during Banzai charge while defending his command post against Japanese attackers, firing pistol until ammunition was exhausted and then fighting with rifle as club before being overwhelmed by multiple attackers, posthumously receiving Medal of Honor for his stand that inspired troops around him and that contributed to containing Japanese penetration at critical point. The deaths of officers and senior NCOs during Banzai charge created leadership challenges that were met by junior officers and by enlisted men who took command of units when senior leadership became casualties, demonstrating individual initiative and courage that allowed American defenses to hold despite the ferocity of Japanese attack. The containment and elimination of Banzai charge required approximately 6 hours of continuous fighting, during which American forces systematically destroyed Japanese groups that had penetrated American lines, using combination of infantry attacks to isolate Japanese positions and artillery and tank fires to destroy them, with some Japanese groups fighting until last man was killed, and with others committing suicide when their positions became hopeless. The casualties from Banzai charge included approximately 3,000 to 3,500 Japanese killed, representing virtual annihilation of attacking force, while American casualties totaled 650 killed and approximately 950 wounded, demonstrating again that while Japanese could inflict significant casualties through suicidal attacks, such attacks could not change battle outcome and represented waste of lives that might have been preserved through surrender. The advance into northernmost Saipan during July 7-9, following destruction of Banzai charge, saw American forces compressing remaining Japanese defenders and remaining Japanese civilians into progressively smaller area, with fighting during this phase being characterized by smaller actions against isolated Japanese positions and by tragic encounters with Japanese civilians who had been convinced by propaganda that Americans would torture and kill them and who chose suicide over surrender. The civilian suicides at Marpi Point and at other locations along Saipan's northern cliffs during July 9th represented war's most horrifying episodes, with hundreds and possibly thousands of Japanese civilians, including entire families, jumping from cliffs into ocean approximately 100 to 800 feet below, depending on location. American forces witnessing suicides attempted desperately to prevent them through using loudspeakers to broadcast messages in Japanese, urging civilians to surrender and promising safety and medical treatment, through displaying captured Japanese civilians who could testify that Americans were treating prisoners humanely, through physically attempting to restrain people approaching cliff edges, and through positioning boats and rescue swimmers offshore to rescue people who jumped and survived falls. But these efforts saved only a fraction of those who chose death, with most civilians either jumping before Americans could reach them or choosing to jump despite American appeals to surrender, demonstrating power of propaganda and of Japanese military culture that valued death over surrender, and that extended that value to civilians who were told that honor required suicide rather than surrender. The suicides included mothers throwing children from cliffs before jumping themselves, entire families holding hands and jumping together, individuals jumping alone after watching others jump, and people jumping after being pushed or ordered to jump by Japanese soldiers who enforced Japanese government's message that surrender was dishonorable and death was preferable. The scenes traumatized American servicemen who witnessed them, with many reporting nightmares and psychological distress from watching civilians choose death and from being unable to prevent tragedies despite their efforts, with some Americans being haunted for the remainder of their lives by memories of children being thrown from cliffs or families jumping together. The death toll from civilian suicides was never established precisely, with estimates ranging from approximately 1,000 at Marpi Point alone to as many as 8,000 to 10,000 across entire island, when including suicides at other locations, and when including civilians killed during fighting or who died from disease and starvation during battle. The recovery of bodies from water and from base of cliffs continued for weeks after battle ended, with many bodies never being recovered and with exact death toll remaining unknown. The civilian tragedy at Saipan created awareness that as American forces approached Japan itself, civilian casualties would become increasingly significant, and the Japanese propaganda and Japanese military culture would create situations where civilians would choose death rather than accepting surrender that Americans would have honored. The end of organized Japanese resistance on July 9, 1944, when last organized Japanese units were destroyed or scattered, and when American forces secured entire island, marked conclusion of battle that had lasted 25 days and that had achieved American objectives of capturing Saipan and eliminating Japanese military presence, but at costs that exceeded initial predictions and that demonstrated fighting's intensity would increase as American forces approached Japan. The American casualties totaled 13,690, including 3,126 killed and 10,364 wounded, representing approximately 19% casualty rate for forces engaged and representing some of highest casualty rates in any Pacific campaign to that date. Japanese military casualties exceeded 29,000 killed, including virtually entire garrison with only approximately 1,000 being captured alive, most being Koreans or other non-Japanese who had less commitment to Japanese propaganda about honor requiring death over surrender. The strategic consequences of Saipan's capture included immediate establishment of airbase construction projects that would create fields capable of handling B-29 Superfortress bombers, with first B-29 raid against Tokyo being launched from Saipan in November 1944, beginning strategic bombing campaign that would intensify through 1945, and that would contribute significantly to Japan's eventual surrender. The political consequences in Japan included fall of Tojo government in July 1944. When Saipan's loss made clear that Japan was losing war and that previous assurances about holding inner defensive perimeter had been false, though new government continued war despite increasing evidence that Japan's strategic position was hopeless. The Battle of Saipan from June 15 to July 9, 1944, killed 3,126 Americans, wounded 10,364, killed 29,000 Japanese military personnel, killed 8,000 to 10,000 civilians, secured American air bases for strategic bombing of Japan, demonstrated increasing costs of approaching Japanese home islands, and revealed through civilian suicides the cultural factors that would complicate final phases of Pacific War, making Saipan critical turning point where American victory became inevitable, but where path to victory would require continued heavy casualties and continued brutal fighting.